Well, good morning from my time zone. For others that are tuning in on the East Coast, good afternoon, and some from Europe, good evening. So we're going to have two excellent speakers, and I'll just briefly introduce them in a minute. You will have seen their biographies in the materials when you register. We're going to start with Richard Foltin. He has a long career in law. He's credited with several bar associations, including the Supreme Court. Issues related to workplace are very familiar and part of his expertise. So he'll be leading off, giving us sort of the background and what the legal parameters are, understanding this topic and how a religious accommodation applies in this case to vaccines. Following him will be Kent Johnson. And Kent is a senior corporate advisor for the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. He also is accredited with bar associations, and he has a long career as senior counsel at Texas Instruments. So he understands from inside a company, and he'll have some perspective to share from that. So without further ado, Richard, thank you for sharing, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Brian. It's an honor to be with you and with Kent, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Just by way of slightly more introduction about myself, I'm a Religious Freedom Fellow at the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C. For many years, I was with the American Jewish Committee, where, as you indicate, working on workplace religious freedom issues was a major concern of mine. So some introductory points just to get us started. One is I want to make clear the discussion of religious exemptions is different from the question of whether it's advisable, notwithstanding prevailing medical recommendations, to refuse to be vaccinated against COVID-19. And so I just want that to be clear, and also that authorities within the various major denominations and faith groups overwhelmingly do not teach that there is a religious part of vaccination. In fact, many teach that there is an obligation to be vaccinated for the good of the individual and the larger community. Within the Jewish community, we would express that as pikuach nefesh, the preservation of life, which is an overriding value. And finally, I guess the lawyer's disclaimer is this presentation is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice for which you should seek legal or other professional counsel. So the first and major question is whether there is in fact a right to religious exemption for objecting employees as opposed to an employer who makes such exemptions available within its discretion. And this area also, while we're talking about employment today, there's also the whole issue of service providers and whether they're entitled to require vaccination to attend school, use transportation, go to entertainment, which we're not going to focus on, but that's certainly been a big issue as well. So the discussion of this issue invariably takes us back to Jacobson v. Massachusetts, a 1905 case in which the Supreme Court upheld a state law mandating smallpox vaccinations even over religious objections. And while this decision was handed down long before the development of modern church-state doctrine, to this day, the courts have not found that there's a constitutional right to a religious exemption from a mandatory vaccine. To be sure, the law on religious exemptions has gone through many changes over the years. The right to a religious exemption from the application of a particular law reached its low point in the famous, or some would say infamous, case of Employment Division against Smith, in which the High Court held that there was no constitutional right to religious exemption from a generally applicable non-discriminatory law. We are now seeing a Supreme Court that is more and more finding a basis, even under the reasoning of Smith, to hold for religious claimants. Thus, in a recent case, the court preliminarily ruled in favor of a church that sought to set aside capacity limitations imposed by California in the name of the COVID-19 public health emergency. Now, one might imagine sustaining of a claim for a religious exemption from a government vaccine mandate on similar grounds, but we just don't know. We don't know if the court's going to go in that direction. For now, I'd expect the Jacobson rule to remain in place. Having said that, at least so far, most companies and most schools, as regards their faculty and student bodies, have allowed religious exemptions to vaccine mandates. The theory is that sufficient numbers of people comply with the mandate, that herd immunity is not compromised. It follows then that should the percentage of vaccinated people fall below the level needed to foster herd immunity, exemptions could be terminated except for medical reasons. Most of the action right now, however, is not in the constitutional realm, but has to do with claims for religious accommodation under the employment discrimination provisions of the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act provides that an employer must afford a reasonable accommodation for employees' religious beliefs and practice, unless doing so would impose an undue hardship on the employer. Undue hardship has been defined by the courts as anything more than a minimal difficulty or expense. So the bar an employer has to meet to deny a religious accommodation is pretty low. Some states and local anti-discrimination laws have set a higher bar that is more protective of employees, typically by providing that a religious accommodation must be allowed absent significant difficulty or expense. While employers were initially disinclined to mandate vaccinations, that changed when the FDA made approval of the Pfizer vaccine final. Employers have reportedly been surprised by the high volume of employees requesting a religious exemption from COVID-19 vaccination mandates. As they receive these requests, employers must be aware that Title VII calls for a communicative process and a consideration of ways to make the religious accommodation, even if not necessarily the one suggested by the employee. In other words, a blanket refusal does not ordinarily satisfy the requirements of Title VII. Many employers therefore have in place a process for considering requests for religious exemptions from government company policy, with respect to holy days off, dress, grooming, objectionable duties, and now vaccines. And I should note here, there's now pending a class action against United Airlines seeking relief from their vaccine mandate under Title VII. And please, I would ask everybody to put themselves on mute. I'm hearing some background noise. I don't know whether it's part of the problem is that they have not gone through that conciliatory process, but it could certainly be the case. So there's certainly plenty of basis for an employer to say that it is undue hardship. It is an undue hardship to allow a religious exemption, particularly in the context of a national public health emergency for which there is now an approved prophylactic treatment. The health and safety of other employees and customers, costs of the business, liability if exempted employees infect others, among other considerations. But as I already said, you can't simply say, well, therefore no accommodation. Among the employee alternatives an employer may consider, and here I quote the EOC guidelines on how their rules relate to the COVID-19 situation, required reading, I would say, for those interested in such things. The EOC guidelines say what could be considered as a reasonable accommodation includes an unvaccinated employee entering the workplace might wear a face mask, work at a social distance from coworkers or non-employees, work a modified shift, get periodic tests for COVID-19, be given the opportunity to telework, or finally accept a reassignment. This is a good point at which to note that the executive orders issued in September mandating that federal employees and employees of federal contractors be vaccinated do not explicitly override the provisions of Title VII that the EOC guidelines are intended to implement. So, how that would play out, and here again, I have to say, consult your local attorney, but there's certainly a question as to whether or not those executive orders are not still subject to the reasonable accommodation provisions of Title VII. I'm sure the courts and regulatory agencies will be dealing with those issues. Other issues include the sincerity of the request for the employer to think about whether it is in fact, the request is in fact grounded in religion as opposed to merely political. Questioning the employee in this area has to be done carefully so as to avoid engaging in what may appear to be discriminatory contact, such as by expressions of hostility or retaliation. So I'll just conclude by saying there are no easy answers. These are weighty questions of public health and religious freedom that we're dealing with today. At the end of the day, the employers need to be respectful of employees even as they consider what their response ought to be. And we also need voices of religious leaders to address the responsibilities of their congregants to others that are entwined with concerns about vindicating their right to religious freedom. And with that, I'll stop here, Brian. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And Kent, please share your thoughts now from a corporate.
Sure. Now, first, I'll just note this is not a debate between Richard and me. We're not on different sides. Although this issue,
Right.
you know, has been so divisive, and many people are kind of lining up. In fact, even within my family, there's a strong disagreement among certain members of the family and others about the religious ground for an objection to the vaccine. It split churches and all sorts of religious organizations. This is a hot topic for many reasons. And I think one of the main core issues that I've seen over and over again has been the crisis of credibility, the belief that the other side is lying, and that belief is grounds for a righteous indignation to stand up and say no, or to insist on a freedom exemption, this idea of liberty for everyone. As Brian said, I'm associated with the foundation, so I am not going to take a position on this. This will not be a talk that will give you a checklist on how to get the exemption. Some people are putting that out there, and I think I'll explain why I think that's dangerous. So the question, is it religious? Is your objection religious, or is it something else? Is it based on maybe you're worried about the effectiveness or the safety of the vaccine, or maybe you think the government's lying about some aspect of the need for a vaccine or the efficacy of the vaccine, or you just have a feeling that it's creeping tyranny. The justification for a religious exemption on those kinds of grounds is extremely shaky. Now, I should say this, different states have different laws on this, and Richard mentioned the complexities involved here, but it's really quite interesting. The wording of the religious exemption in one state can differ quite a bit from the other. But what is a religious exemption? You have to ask yourself. In some cases, in fact, the EEOC has spoken about it not being tethered to a particular sect. You don't need to have a religious leader pronouncing. Richard mentioned that none of the major religious organizations have said that you must say no to the vaccine, and that's true. Even the Christian Science religion has not said that its members must reject the vaccine. However, when you're looking into someone's religious grounds, it need not be tethered to a particular religion, a religious doctrine, the religion of no vaccine or whatever it is. It can be a sincerely held belief at the level that one would normally ascribe to a religious belief. So even if it's not tethered to a particular faith, if a person sincerely holds that. But questions have to be asked when an employer is between the pressures here. If the employer gives too lax a hurdle and too many people go in not vaccinated, the employer risks the danger that the population will have a lot more COVID, quite frankly. On the other hand, if they're too firm and say no excuse, no religious exemption whatsoever will be tolerated, then the employer risks a situation where somebody goes in, gets the vaccine is forced to get the vaccine and has a negative reaction to the vaccine and then sues the employer, or any number of other complications. So you're sort of darned if you do and darned if you don't. So it's helpful, I think, to think in terms of how the employers are facing this. So my final remarks just have little time here, but we do want to take questions, so I want to allow time for that, is to talk a little bit about communication. What if an employer or employee wants to express his or her opinion about all this to the employees? Much of the consternation and anger that I have seen around this topic surrounds the feeling that different opinions are squashed, that there's a gag order, that certain people should not be permitted to cite their experts in contravention to the government approved experts. And we all have those experts that we feel more trustworthy than others. But these kinds of arguments are not religious. I mean, it's hard to make the case that they're religious in nature. My point about communication is this: the Religious Freedom in Business Foundation is all about authenticity and connection. And we have seen it work, where people with radically different worldviews can speak openly about why they believe what they do with people who disagree with them, and do so in a civil way and engage without rancor and hatred. This is one of those topics that cries out for a connection. So I would encourage, again, get your own lawyer in your own jurisdiction, but as someone talking on this in this media, I would encourage every company to be to bend over backwards to enable respectful conversation around the whys and wherefores of this issue, and don't try to just dictate and then go away. In many cases, that's the main desire of people who are seeking exemption. I've found that they want to be heard, and they want their sources and their experts to be taken seriously. So we do want to leave some time for questions. Not promising to answer all the questions or to be the.
From Manila, we have a question. What are some questions that employers can ask employees to understand the difference between a religious exemption request versus a personal conviction that's not based on religion?
I'll start, and
Okay.
then you can pick. I would say that there's two things that I would just mention. One is just having that conversation that we've both talked about, that the employer and the employee have to have. Oftentimes, it comes out in that conversation that what they're concerned about is, their experts aren't getting enough attention, versus that there's really something religious at stake. And so, even without asking this question that's directed at that, you can elicit that information. I would also say there've been a lot of cases now of people who try to prove their objection by using basically postcards that are being circulated, basically formatted standard letters requesting the exemption and saying this person has a religious exemption. And some employees report they get hundreds of these. And I think I think it's a fair question as what is your connection with this organization? Do you really adhere to these religious beliefs? And I think, frankly, it may not be dispositive, but reliance on that kind of proof that one really has this religious belief, I think puts in question the sincerity of the person who's doing that, as opposed to coming in with what's an authentic articulation of a religious perspective that they have.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good point. I would add that in some cases, pastoral letters they're very interesting. Some of the pastoral letters that I've seen attest to the individual's true, sincere belief that the vaccine would violate his conscience and his beliefs. And those, it seems to me, come a little bit closer to passing muster than this, I got a form letter that says that my body is a temple of the Holy Spirit and I can't introduce anything bad to it. And therefore, that just is a little bit too glib. And especially the idea of just sort of checking the box. I've got the formula for getting out of the requirement is this: you say these words and you'll be good. And that strains credulity. The other thing we haven't talked about is the objection on the grounds of the use of fetal cell lines for research into the vaccines. And I think that's an important area for religious freedom advocates. For some, this is a hugely important thing. And one of the questions that is being asked by some employers is, well, if you have an objection to this vaccine, then that means that you must not be taking any other medications that used or benefited from fetal cell research. So do you take aspirin? Do you take Tums, Benadryl, Sudafed? If you take any of those, it raises, quite frankly, it does raise, in my mind, a credibility problem here. Is this just sort of selective? You know, there was a case that said objection to the Vietnam War in particular, as opposed to war in general, is not sufficient grounds for an religious exemption from selective service. And this is that kind of thing. It's, gee, if you don't give a rip whether fetal cells were used in all these other products that you're using to develop them, then why are you, is it real? I'd also point out this whole debate is an opportunity for introspection, for you to ask yourself, what is it that I really believe with the passion of my belief? And what's the core of that? And yeah, that is a healthy thing for all of us to do periodically, I think.
There's a question as a faith ERG, employee resource group leader in the company. Are there some resources? How do we navigate this issue? So the EOC document is in the chat. That's one. Kent or Richard, are there other resources that you could point them to?
Kent, go ahead.
This is tough because there's so much out there. And the danger is, depending on your search criteria on Google, you will get legal opinions and medical opinions all over the map. I wish it differs so much from state to state that's difficult as well. I'm hard pressed to give you a litmus test, a source for a litmus test on this thing.
Yeah, I don't think there's a litmus test, as you say. There's a lot of different perspectives. I think just to start, it's worthwhile just looking at those executive orders that have riled people so much, requiring that employees of federal contracts or federal employees be vaccinated. I think it's worthwhile just to see those, to see what's not in there as opposed to what's in there, and which has left for me some questions as to whether or not, in terms of somebody's rights under Title VII, either of those make a whole lot of difference. That they would have the same, perhaps they have the same rights they would have where a private employer is mandating vaccines.
I think this is a complicated question, but it comes to the heart of it. How can an employer make an objective determination of whether a belief is sincerely held? What sort of avenues or pathways exist for evaluating sincerity? Good question.
That's very well, Richard, you had said earlier, it's really dangerous waters, very difficult. I mean, think about it. How do you gauge the sincerity of any person you're talking to? Do they really mean it? Or is this just a ruse to get out of doing something they don't like, or they object to for other reasons? But we've mentioned some of them, whether there's consistency in their actual practice that lines up with their profession of an objection on principle. And what is the principle? And I would ask everybody to wrestle with this question. What is the principle that I am resting on before I insist on an exemption that others may feel, is going to endanger them?
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile to note that when the courts deal with religious accommodation issues or religious issues generally, they stay away oftentimes from determining whether or not it's sincere. They just proceed on the assumption it is sincere and then make a decision as to whether or not the accommodation should be provided. So if the courts, which are in the business of examining credibility, that's their day job all day, especially trial judges, stay away from this kind of question. You can imagine how difficult it is to do. But I do think not only consistency, but it's black letter law that one need not adhere to the orthodoxies of a particular religion to have a sincere religious belief. That is, yes, you can be off on your own, but it doesn't hurt if you belong to an organized faith group or part of a sect or whatever that has articulated a set of beliefs. It's certainly going to make your case easier to prove and easier to show sincerity if that adheres. And that's probably unfair, not consistent with what we understand the law to be. But I think it's the case nevertheless, that if you're out there and doing something or saying things that can't be verified in any way, you're in a tougher position than someone who's more hooked into what are traditional belief systems.
So thank you, everyone, and we'll have another call next month on a rather different topic. Our upcoming Dare to Overcome conference in May 23 to 25 for employee resource groups, how they can be allies of others within their companies. It'll be a less hot topic, but one that is pertinent to many companies. So again, thank you, and have a good day to everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.